Hi, this is Paul Schock with the SCIPP program. We're here at the Restoration Community Church, and we're doing our panel discussion today on domestic violence. And right now I would have the panelists introduce themselves.
I'm Sergeant Brooks Brockmeyer of the Scott City Police Department.
My name is Christy Phelps, and I'm a licensed professional counselor with Boot Hill Counseling Services, and I'm also a domestic violence survivor.
First off, Brook, if you can actually talk to us about a little bit about your own experience in the subject.
My experience?
Yeah.
I'm a 15-year veteran of law enforcement, so domestic violence is something that I hold pretty near and dear. Unfortunately, it's a crime that is sometimes tough to investigate. Crimes against family are things that impact multiple people. In the 15 years that I've been in law enforcement, I've been able to help people survive domestic violence situations and use resources such as my counterpart to my right here to help people get out of those situations. So something that's very important to talk about.
I kind of have dual experience. As a counselor, I often find myself working with individuals who are either experiencing or have experienced domestic violence. I've been a counselor, gosh, I guess about 15, 16 years. I've lost track. That's how long it's been. Also, I have experience as a domestic violence survivor, so I feel like I can bring some authenticity to the experience with my clients and help them navigate a system that often seems to be stacked against us.
Can you actually sort of map us through some of your experiences of individuals that you see going through this whole process? Either or both.
Go ahead.
Okay. It just, the way things usually happen for me as far as my professional work is, and I will just say as a survivor too, being in a domestic violence situation is really difficult to talk about because people make a lot of assumptions about you, so you keep a lot of that to yourself and just kind of like live a comfortable misery is what one of my friends calls it. So oftentimes in my work, I don't find out, well, say I've been working with clients a couple of months before I finally find out that there is abuse present because they have to feel safe enough to bring that forward. And once they do, one of the things I really wanted to emphasize today was one of the worst things that we can do is ask a victim of domestic violence why they don't just leave. You literally cannot just get up and leave unless you have the resources to do so. And as a survivor, I will say we often know ways to keep ourselves safe that no one has thought about. So when a man or a woman brings forth to me that they are in a domestic violence situation, we just kind of explore where you are in that process right now. Is it safe to leave? Is that something we can even talk about? And if it's not, we'll start making a safety plan to hopefully help them exit in the future.
Brook?
I can speak on the subject. We're usually the first call to respond to the domestic violence situations. I can say that a lot of times I think people experience domestic violence without making that phone call. So we may be, showing up on a scene where this has been a pattern of behavior for a long time, and sometimes maybe the victim has found the opportunity to get to a phone or get to a resource to let us know that, those crimes have taken place. Sometimes we're the first stop, to intervene in a domestic situation. And again, then we're able to utilize our resources, such as, counseling and CMO NASB and Boot Hill counseling, things like that to help these people get out of those situations. I think it's paramount for officers to investigate a domestic violence situation very, very open-minded, because I feel like a lot of the times people are scared to talk about domestic violence. There's a stigma that surrounds domestic violence. As she said, people fear judgment. What somebody else is going to think about the situation. Sometimes people are predisposed to pick a side, and I don't think that's fair. As an officer, we need to be objective, and again, utilize those resources available to help members of our community survive and get out of those situations.
So one of the things that automatically comes to mind that from a lot of people when you say domestic violence, they automatically think of someone getting beaten up. And I don't think that they think of the idea of domestic violence being verbal or mental. And then at the same time, you also brought up another thing, is that most people think the domestic violence is done on females. So if you can address either of those two, either one of you or both.
I think it's important that people understand that domestic violence isn't always a physical violence. It could be emotional, mental abuse. It could be deprivation of services or access to communication. Domestic violence isn't what the normal everyday citizen may think it is. It's not always a physical assault or an unwanted touch. I mean, it is a pattern of behavior from, again, restricting somebody's communication to outside sources. Somebody needs to call for assistance and they deprive them of a cell phone or communication. I mean, those are all things that are part of domestic violence. And I can let her elaborate on that some.
I was going to say, I think that's a very accurate statement, and part of that, I think, is the media, like the Lifetime movies where the woman's beaten black and blue and she leaves in the night. Those things do happen, but oftentimes we also have concurrently running, we have some financial abuse, some spiritual abuse, sexual abuse. I know in my case, I had lots of litigation abuse where I felt like I kept being drugged to court over and over and over for issues that weren't really that big of an issue, and things like that are not.
Got an in-progress call, so I can join back as soon as.
That's fine. One of our officers is actually having to take off for an emergency, so.
Good luck.
The issue of going back to one of the things as far as the issue of that's mainly females, is that a big issue, or?
The statistics show us that domestic violence proportionately affects more females, but that doesn't mean that that's where it stops. Men are also affected. The belief is that just due to the culture of men and so forth, that not as many men come forward. And the statistics in the LGBT community with domestic violence are also really rising.
Gotcha. Some of the things, I mean, it seems like there's so many issues and so many possibilities of domestic violence that people don't really realize how big the picture is. What are avenues that we can do to educate our fellow neighbors or the community itself about what this problem is and how we can actually address it or approach it with other people?
I think things like that are happening today, I know I was really encouraged talking to the pastor when I got here this morning, because in my own personal experience, when I decided to leave my marriage, people of the faith community often encouraged me not to, saying, that's not God's will. You need to work it out. It's not that bad. I think that we have to stand in a place of recognizing that we don't know how bad it is for somebody, and just take them at their word. I think that you have to be open to having conversations with people that are hard and not just giving people a pat on the back. One of my biggest pet peeves in life is when you are at the grocery store and you ask somebody how they are, and you don't stop to listen to their response. I think that we have just really got to communicate. And my opinion is that domestic violence is a lot more talked about and a lot more known now because of like social media efforts. I really appreciate that. There's a lot of like breakout groups that are trying to eliminate this issue, and it's a lot easier, in my opinion, for victims to easily find resources than it used to be.
I know that it seems like a lot of topics and issues cross over. I mean, whether it's alcoholism, drug abuse, human trafficking, being raised up in your background. I mean, a lot of these issues all intertwine at times with domestic violence. How do you actually address one issue without dealing with the other issues?
As a counselor, I would say I don't think that you can. There's what we call a systems approach, where you have to look at all the systems a person is interacting in and how they affect their day-to-day life. And it's really kind of impossible to pull somebody out of a system and say, okay, let's just look at this one, because that's just not the way that our lives work. So I don't know the answer to that, unfortunately.
Which it seems logical, because it all affects everyone.
Absolutely.
And the other thing that it seems like statistically, especially in the Boot Hill area and smaller towns, such as Scott City itself, and I know that a lot of other smaller towns have the same problem, is that, and we've talked about it a lot, is that I would say over half of the population in Scott City are in rental properties. And I would say a quarter of those that have kids that are going to school, the kids might stay within that school district for 6 months to a year. And then they're shipped over to another place because of one situation or another. And it just seems like a lot of this helps insulate and isolate what's really going on in the family, and it perpetuates generational and reinsures generational that this behavior still can manifest itself.
Absolutely. One of the things that we see in the agency where I work, I would say on a daily basis, is the outcome of housing insecurity and people having to scramble to find any place to live, which does result in, for lack of a better term, the house hopping, children changing school districts, and so forth. And the Boot Hill area is also kind of known for being like a lower socioeconomic population, which makes it, in my opinion, harder for victims of domestic violence to have the financial resources to, like, if you want to leave, go rent your own apartment. If you want to leave, get your own car. It's just can be almost nearly impossible. And then you've got the situation of the isolation, where if somebody does want to leave, they don't even know who to contact, and then they don't have the financial resources to do so.
And I think that goes back to reinsuring the situation where the individual is actually isolated, as you're saying, and not having the knowledge or the education to know how to get out of the situation. I mean, I can't fathom to even imagine, and I've seen situations where you do have individuals that are in domestic abused families, and you're right, they don't want to leave because, one, they don't have any money. They don't have the resources to actually find a place or figure out a way to get their kids out of the situation. Because of the system, it's really hard for them to actually just take the kids with them without becoming the victim. So how do you actually address these issues?
One of the things that I wanted to point out today is that once you do make that decision, if you happen to be a person who has children, you make the decision to leave, there just seems to be like a narrative that always happens. And then if it's a woman that leaves, then dad says, oh, I want the kids. Then there's a custody battle, and which in my opinion keeps the victim / survivor from being able to speak their truth, because then you're scared to go into the courtroom setting and say what horrible things this person has done to you because of fear of retaliation. I wish that I had the answer to your question. I am very passionate about infiltrating the court system and getting judges and attorneys and legal advocates just much more familiar with what domestic violence looks like. I remember in an early experience of mine seeking an order of protection and a judge actually saying to me, you just don't want him to see your kids. I'm going to put the two of you in a room and let you fight it out. So that is what you're up against as a survivor. And then you're humiliated because you've finally gotten the courage to go speak your truth, and then you get knocked down like that. And like I said, I wish there were a clear-cut answer. I think we're closer than we have been, but we're not there yet.
I'm sure, as you had said, we're closer with social media and actually getting things out there in educational viewpoint. And I know years ago, just like a lot of things, things are pushed aside into a dark closet so that people don't really want it brought out because they're ashamed of it. Mm-hmm. And families are ashamed of it for their own families. And that now we're in a spot, as you had said, that hopefully we can actually use that as a bouncing board to go forward. I've seen, I was bringing up with a couple other people, going back to social media, even social different types of movies and things like that. You were talking about Lifetime, which is far extreme.
Yeah.
I think that one of the movies that I've actually saw just recently on Netflix was The Maid. And it seemed very poignant in the sense of it was very realistic of showing you how things transpire and the frustrations
Mm-hmm.
of the system for an individual to try to break out of that system. And I think that's the big issue, is that here in the Boot Hill area is that if you do have an avenue to call as yourself and other people, it's still hard to actually find spaces or a place or trying to help re-educate and support that individual, is it not?
Absolutely, it is. One thing that you were talking about that led me back to an earlier question about how do we intervene is that, first of all, I haven't seen the show you talked about, because a lot of shows like that are very hard for me to watch. But when I have acquaintances that see things like that, it never fails to kind of like amaze me how many people will reach out to me, because I'm pretty vocal about being a survivor, and just say, hey, I was watching this show and I think that maybe I'm being abused. And so that's something I meant to mention earlier. I think that we have to talk a lot about abuse isn't just the hitting and what forth, and speak about the struggles like you were mentioning that are in that show. Because of my own personal experience, sometimes I'll see people going through things now, and I'll kind of be looking through my domestic violence lens and be able to be like, hey, what's really going on? And if people can spend time like we are today educating themselves on like the smaller microscopic signs of abuse, I think that that's when we're going to start to make change. But like, I always don't know how to make the change except for in my little corner.
I hear you. I understand, and that's the big issue. Is, I mean, there's a lot of unknowns, And even for the individual that's trying to get out of the situation, or even thinking about getting out of the situation, the fear of the unknown, because they don't know if it's going to make it worse. They don't know if it's going to actually perpetuate themselves into another realm that they're not familiar with.
That I'm glad that you brought that up, because one of the things I want to point out that's unique to us survivors that live in Missouri is that when you look at the statistic that once a survivor / victim decides to leave, they are more likely to be harmed or killed than they were if they stayed in the relationship. And Missouri also has no sort of legislation that says people who have been convicted of domestic violence have to have their gun taken away. They can have all the guns that they want. And the statistics about that show us that I'm going to say a woman, because I'm thinking about myself, is 5 times more likely to die if the abuser owns a firearm.
And I've heard case studies that have gone through the court systems where individual was actually domestically abused, or even a gun was actually involved, and in order to deal with it in the court system, they end up, the individuals wanting to actually still have the right to have the firearm, so they plead to a lesser cause so that they can still have the gun. And if you're bringing up a good subject, because that is a big issue, is that if someone's actually threatening someone with a gun and the court system ends up bringing it down to a misdemeanor or a different non-felony charge, then they can still have their gun.
Absolutely, they can. And I think it does not help. I have nothing against people who hunt. I was born and raised in Southeast Missouri, and understand that hunting and fishing are a big part of our culture. And I think the first thing people yell out is like, you want to take away our shotgun so we can't rabbit hunt on Saturday morning or whatever. No, that's not it. I don't want people to die, because the statistics show us that in most deaths there is a firearm involved. And like you said, the legal system is just doing its job, and I can appreciate that. Like, if you're an attorney, obviously you want to get your client a lesser charge, because that's what they're paying you for. But at the end of the day, if you're letting someone leave with a gun that is an abuser, you've contributed to the problem unknowingly.
Well, I think in some ways, if we paint a picture of an individual that is an abuser, it's most likely they've been in a family that were abusers themselves. And as much as we all would like to say that we don't want to be an abuser, when you're actually in that situation and growing up in that environment, that's all you're used to. And the other idea, people don't realize it's just like alcoholism, that the individual is in the mind frame and cannot get out of that mind frame of being the abuser. And once they get on that path of and mind stream, you can't break that. It's just like a drug. You just keep on going with it. So that abuser will probably grab whatever they can to actually deal with their aggression, deal with their frustration, and whatever misconducts they have onto that victim.
I'm glad that you brought that up too, because there is a thing that happens in our area pretty often that's pretty upsetting to me, is Jane and Joe Smith go to court for a domestic violence issue. Joe is court ordered to attend anger management classes, and what research actually shows us is that sending an abuser to anger management classes usually increases the violence in the home. Number one, because of the resentment of having to go, and then it's kind of like you're telling them, hey, it's cool to be angry as long as you contain it and display it in the right places. So there is actually a program called the New York Batterers Intervention Program, commonly referred to as BIP. That's one of the only evidence-based treatments for abusers. and that particular treatment is hard to access in our area. So I'm always a little concerned because we get the victim out of the situation, but then we still have this abuser at large who is not receiving treatment and can just go to the next household and continue this cycle.
And it's as you're bringing it up, it's almost, if we put in logic side, it's almost like a wounded animal that is constantly going to lash out at things, and which is a shame.
That's a good way to put it, the wounded animal, because there's so much. I usually do not work with abusers. That's not my cup of
I
tea.
understand.
But when I do, there's a lot of, I just want to lash back at society like a wounded animal wants to lash back.
The it just comes back to the victim, and a lot of times, as I see, and I've understood things, is that even if the victim actually gets out of a bad relationship, a lot of times they go back into another bad relationship, or wanting to get into another relationship just to get out of what they got into, and they find out they're back in the same situation.
There's a saying in domestic violence that you will always choose a familiar hell over an unfamiliar heaven, because that is kind of like what your nervous system is wired to. So when you're in a relationship that doesn't feel chaotic and dangerous, you're like, whoa, this feels weird. So we do see that a lot, and I think a huge part of our work, and I keep coming back to the fact that I'm sitting here in a church talking today, and I think the faith community has got to talk about this more, is helping people see that they're doing that. Like, hey, this new relationship you're in is looking a heck of a lot like that last relationship that you were in, and let's talk about this, and let's get really, I think that our fear of stepping on people's toes oftentimes keeps people in dangerous situations. But you're like, in counseling, I cannot tell you how many times I've seen a woman and her children leave a domestic violence situation. They come in the next week and they're living with a new boyfriend, and you're like, what? Like, you need to take some time to heal, to get yourself together. But I think it just goes back to, like I said, being in that place of familiarity.
And from your experience of dealing with victims, how does the effect happen not only with the victim, but the victim's family, the kids?
How does it affect them?
Yeah. And how do you deal with that?
That is huge. I had the luxury of working with an attorney named Barry Goldstein during my own custody trial. He's an expert witness on domestic violence out of New York, and he did a study which just is amazing to me, that actually says when children are kept in domestic violence situations, the likelihood of them developing chronic diseases like asthma, leukemia, and so forth skyrocket. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there. If anybody wants to look at the ACEs study, that's a pretty interesting study.
Wow.
So when you're working with children of domestic violence, usually one or two things happens. Usually the kids are resilient, I guess is what I'm trying to say, and they can bounce back a lot more quickly than the adults. So a lot of times you feel a little confused working with the kids, because you're like, hey, your mom or dad said the last 3 years have been hell, and you're these happy little creatures, running around the room. So you'll see that where the children seem like they're not reacting, but you'll also see the other extreme of that, where the kids turn inwards and just kind of don't talk about it. Unfortunately, the thing you don't see is a healthy response, because I don't think there is a healthy response to being abused, obviously. And so I always feel like part of my job of working with a parent who's exited the relationship is like saying, hey, these are signs to look for that your kid might be depressed. These are signs to look for that your kid might be experiencing anxiety. So it does affect children, just like I said, because kids are so resilient, we don't see it as quickly.
Well, that brings up the other side of it, too. I mean, people automatically assume, they think of domestic violence as the adults, and sometimes the individual, as far as the mother, might be suppressed so much so that she doesn't have a voice, and the abuse is going on with the kids. And do you see that much?
I don't see a lot of that. Usually what I see is, when I refer to this, I'm going to speak with the assumption that most domestic violence occurs to women, and want to make it clear I do know it happens to men. But what I see a lot is mom is being abused, but dad is a, quote, model father, which gives him some cred in the community. And people are like, there's no way he's being abusive to you. Look at how good he is to those kids. I see that pattern a lot. Now, yes, I have worked with families where the abuse is like family-wide, and that's a different intervention, because as a mandated reporter, I am obligated to make sure that minor children are safe. And I really wrestle with myself in those situations, because I know as a counselor and as a survivor that once I get law enforcement or children's division involved, that the abuse towards the spouse, partner, whomever escalates. So you sit in this very precarious spot of, who do I save first?
And I can imagine in those situations that it's not just the physical abuse. They try to do the mental abuse by trying to cover up everything and figure out ways to cover up the lies.
Absolutely. When all the kids are telling you like a story that sounds like it was been rehearsed, for the last 30 days, you're like, this is really interesting that you all said the exact same thing.
And a lot of them are actually so used to the system that they're used to people coming over and looking in on them the same way, and they just try to snowball the whole thing, so it perpetuates.
Absolutely. It always breaks my heart when I see kids that just kind of assume that every kid has a social worker, every kid, lives the way they do. It's just really, it's sad.
I know it's never easy, and it's never a win-win situation. Is Missouri under the same statute as a lot of other states? If they're called for domestic violence and they do see some physical evidence, is there an arrest that happens right away, or?
I actually am kind of ignorant to that, which makes me feel bad, because like I said, I'm married to a law enforcement officer. But I do know that the state can bring charges sometimes, even when the victim doesn't want to bring charges, if there's enough, physical evidence. And I do know that if, like I mentioned earlier, if children are believed to be harmed, there's no hesitation about reporting that or removing them from the home. I just think when you get two adults involved, like the officer that here said, one of the things that can happen is there's a concept called crazy making, where the abusive partner drives the non-abusive partner literally crazy, and then they call the cops. And maybe the other partner has acted out to defend themselves, and so the cops get there, and then it looks like, well, you both beat each other up. And so there's just a lot of things to sort through in those situations. It really upsets me, because it's almost like that there was this book published for abusers on things to do, because they all kind of do these things.
How to come up with the little triggers and
Yeah.
switches to actually make things happen.
Yeah. There is, well, I wanted to mention this book today for anybody that might be listening, that feels like they may be in an abusive situation, but you're not quite sure because sometimes you don't know. But there's a book called Why Does He Do That? Inside the Minds of Angry and Controlling Men. It's by an author named Lundy Bancroft. And that book is life-changing, in my opinion.
That's something that hopefully we can actually put on, and we'll type it out so people can actually have access to it that later on. What are some of the key issues that you foresee that would be great to have changed in the system?
I was thinking about that on the way here this morning, and a huge issue, in my opinion, is childcare. Because when a man or a woman leaves the situation, then, by default, they're a single parent with limited resources, and you got to work. And then if you got little kids that aren't going to school, they got to go somewhere. And I was thinking back to my days as a single mom. Thank God I was blessed with a supportive family and the resources I needed to make it. But so many people do not have that luxury. And I think as a follower, follower of Christ, that one of the things that churches really need to do is step up and fill in some of those gaps and say, hey, we're going to start an after-school program for kids that need somewhere to go after school because mom has to work. That's a huge thing. I don't know what to do about the inflation. I don't think any of us do. I would be scared to think about leaving a relationship right now with the prices of food and so forth, and food insecurity is a huge thing. You gotta feed yourself when you leave.
You do. And a lot of people, I know from some of the stories I've heard that individuals are actually, as we're talking about isolation, not allowed to use the phone, and they're not allowed to work because there's a fear of jealousy, fear of communication with other people, fear of losing that control.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, and when we're talking about the fear, is that if you do try to move out or try to get help, as we were just talking about, being able to find a job. How do you find a job? Being able to find support for the kids if you do move out, being able to find a place, being able to get that support. It's almost a worse reality than what your present reality is, because it's something that you're not familiar with.
That's what I was referring to when I said once you leave, it often feels like the system is stacked against you. In my own personal survivor journey, my abuser wanted me to drop out of college, and at the time there was things said like, oh, if you drop out of college, you'll be able to have dinner ready for me when we get home, that kind of discussion where it seemed like kind of a good thing to do. And so I think if that happened to me, that probably happens to millions of people everywhere. And then you have these men and women who have been isolated and, like you said, don't have a skill set to take into the job market. Thank goodness I didn't drop out of college. And but I could have. And like you said, then you've got a whole new situation of, we've got this person that needs to be in the work environment, but they've been sitting at home for 3 years because their abuser wouldn't let them work. What do we put on their resume?
Yeah. And 3 years is nice. Some of them are actually even more than that, 10, 15 years.
Correct. It's pretty surprising to me, and I don't know why it's surprising to me. I guess I was raised by one of the strongest independent grandmothers you could ever know. But so when I see women in the age of what my grandmother would be if she was living, that have lived in domestic violence situations their whole life, it just floors me. So you're right. We have people that's all they've ever known.
Yeah.
and they're still there.
What are some of the resources and some of the support that's actually out there that you know of, that people can contact? And can you talk a little bit about those groups, so that people know what they can look to?
Absolutely. So in our area, we have, where I work, Boot Hill Counseling Services. We also have St. Francis Medical Center in our area, which has therapy and other social services. So I don't know as much about the other facilities, but at my facility, you can walk in off the street with a crisis and someone can assist you on the spot with what is going on. As far as domestic violence is concerned, in Sykeston, there is the House of Refuge, the Domestic Violence Safe House. I believe they only accept women and children at this time. I always kind of wonder about that. Like, if a man does need a safe place to go, like, where would we send them? So that's another topic for another day. But the Safe House in Cape, it's also just right up the road. They do an excellent job. They have a thrift store that you can go shop at that helps support their mission. There's Community Counseling Center in Cape that would be, more than willing to help people. The thing about our area is I think that we do have resources, but being a person that works at one of those resources, our hands are often tied about how much we could help. Like we were talking about earlier with the housing insecurity, we have so many people that need housing, and the government only gives us so much money to assist with that every year.
And I know on the housing side of it is, sometimes it takes 6 months to a year it's no easy answer to get the housing.
No.
And there's a lot of other loops that they have to cover, to financial background and.
Yep. For immediate assistance, I would recommend that people go to like a local community mental health center and just kind of like let somebody know what's going on. I really wish that there were a program. You know how there's like Big Brothers, Big Sisters? I wish that there was a program like that for people who are leaving abusive relationships, where I could like be partnered up with somebody and say, hey, I get it. I've been there. This is what we're going to do, because you almost need somebody at that time in your life to tell you what the heck to do. So just food for thought.
It's almost like Alcohol Anonymous. You actually have a sponsor that actually has been through it and helps guide you through the process, which sounds like it would be a good scenario for someone that's been abused. And that's the other thing, is that I think the hard thing is, as you were talking about, individuals that are actually abused, they're so suppressed that they don't want to talk about their abuse, what's going on. They don't want to write it down. They don't want to report it to anyone. And the biggest thing you hear from people is, so have you said this to anyone? Have you reported it? And it's like, well, you're just re-abusing the abuser.
It's hard to talk about it because, like I mentioned earlier, oftentimes the abuser has presented themselves in such a light in the community that people are like, what? He's not abusive. She's not abusive. I've seen how they act at church on Sunday morning. I've seen them at Walmart or whatever. I know there was a lot of stigma for myself, the fact that I was in school to be a counselor and here I was being abused. I knew better. But looking back, I think sometimes I was like, well, at least I'm not dead in a ditch somewhere. My abuse isn't that bad. We've also got to stop that kind of talk and comparing one abuse to another. Abuse is abuse is abuse. Because I think a lot of women that I've worked with has said things like, well, I didn't want to say anything because, he does pay the bills. So,
or he's good to the kids.
Yeah. Or, and you can get it. Like, if you're facing being homeless with your 4 kids, you just make it work.
Do you foresee, when you're talking about having a mentor program that would be ideal, do you foresee something that could be done in the schools?
In the
Schools, as far as educational.
One of the things I think that has happened in recent times that I think is absolutely wonderful is the schools are talking about domestic violence, even with the little guys. You know, this isn't a healthy relationship. So I think that we have that going. I actually heard of a school last week, though, that wouldn't allow a conversation like that. So I found that interesting. But I think that there could be some sort of, I don't know what that would look like in the school, but some sort of program for children who are experiencing the effects of domestic violence, and somebody who's been there and done that. I just think peer-led programs are usually the best, because it's hard to talk to somebody who clearly doesn't get it. So I don't know. There are so many things I would like to see implemented, like when I had to go to court by myself and sit and face my abuser in a courtroom. I wish so many times there had been like a person that was assigned to be with me. It's really, really scary.
Isn't the victim advocate supposed to be with you, or?
There is supposed to be a victim advocate, but that's a lot harder system to navigate in my county anyway than what you would think.
I understand. It just seems to me that as we're talking, that it's almost like the victims are almost on their own little world, and it's almost like they're brainwashed, for say, and isolated, and even the families are, and it's hard to reach.
Yeah, the abuse definitely doesn't just touch the family of origin. Oftentimes the abuser is telling their side of the story to the parents and the grandparents, and then you've created this false narrative that everybody believes, which also makes it harder for the victim to stand up and say what's really going on, because everybody is like, well, that's not what we heard. We heard this. Like I said, there almost seems to be like a handbook of these are the steps that you take to make sure everybody believes that you're not an abuser. I see that a lot, like a person that wants to leave, but they're scared to tell their parents.
It almost seems like there needs to be also a handbook on how to leave.
There actually is a handbook on how to leave. It's called Time's Up. I will have to look up the name of the author. She actually passed away, but she was a domestic violence survivor, and she wrote an excellent book on how to leave. The thing that's tricky about leaving is when I'm working with somebody that wants to leave, I can't send that book home with them. You know, if the abuser finds it, that's a whole other issue. So you have to be very, very discreet and very careful when you're working with somebody that wants to leave to make sure they aren't taking traces of evidence home with them so the abuser knows that they're about to leave.
And it seems like, even if it was online, the abuser might be able to find it online,
yeah,
too.
They could look at the history. A lot of times when you'll go to like the Missouri Coalition Against Domestic Violence website, it will actually have instructions on the website about how to clear your history for that very reason. Or it'll say, if your abuser is in the room, exit this page immediately, because those are
triggers.
They're dangerous situations for the victim to be in.
That's sort of amazing, actually, here. I mean, can you tell us some of the experiences that you've had as far as being a counselor, of successes and stories, and maybe stories that didn't work out as well?
I'm thinking in my head, making sure I can tell them in a confidential manner. I have seen one particular family that I worked with they've moved out of the area now, and they just make me smile thinking about them. I had worked with the family, well, the mother of the family, a couple of years, and finally one day she just kind of broke it down for me what was going on, and I was just like, okay, are you ready to leave? She's like, nope. So I'm like, okay, cool, we'll just keep working on what we're working on. About a year later, she was ready to leave because we had started doing some of that groundwork that I was mentioning, like, sticking back $20 at your friend's house when you can, making sure you have a nest egg somewhere. And her and her children were able to leave, and it was just almost like a Cinderella story, like move out of the area, have a home. She did have a skill set, so she was able to work. That was really cool to see that unfold. But unfortunately, I've also been in situations where the victim decided not to leave, and I've read their obituary in the paper a few weeks later, and then you just feel so defeated because you think it didn't have to be that way.
I can imagine it just knocks the wind out of you, and at the same time, I commend all the work that you do with a lot of the victims, because I know it's not easy work, and I know that even from your own experience, to actually have a lot of that on your shoulders, and a lot of those things it's hard not to take home, and wishing that you can actually help everyone.
Definitely.
And sometimes that one successful story actually outshines all the other ones.
Absolutely. I think we all have a calling, and sometimes the circumstances that we find ourselves in lend strength to our calling. And of course, I don't appreciate the fact that I was ever in an abusive situation, but the empathy and the respect that I can bring to victims and survivors means a whole lot to me. And I would, anybody in here that feels passionate about something, I would just say take that out into the world. Somebody needs it, because I get messages on Facebook, I get emails, I get phone calls, just because I'm open with sharing my story. And like you said, one of the things I think about when one woman reaches out to me, I know that about 600 women a year die from domestic violence, one about every 14 hours. And I always think about, this woman reached out, this woman's going to be safe, but what about the woman that's going to die in the next 14 hours? And it's just, like I said earlier, it's heartbreaking because I can't save them all. Nobody can save everybody.
What, you talked about a checklist before. What are some of the top 10 things that you would, off your mind, that you would actually tell somebody
that wants to leave? I think that you need to have a trusted confidant that knows that you're going to leave, and you need to share that with them, because you need to have a place to run to if you can. And you need to have a place to leave your literature that your counselor or social worker is giving you if you can. I would say stash back a little bit of money if you can. If you have a baby, that's something I didn't think about in my own situation. Put back some formula somewhere. You got to feed your babies. Changing passwords to accounts that you, like if you have an email account that you're going to need to use after you leave, make sure the abuser doesn't have the password. I would recommend just making a new account. Taking your car to the police station if you decide to leave, and make sure the abuser does not have a tracking device on it. Getting rid of the cell phone that the abuser has access to, and getting your own phone. Another thing that's come up recently that I think is an excellent idea is creating a document. Like if your abuser has weapons in the home, creating a document that lists the weapons they have in the home. That way, if unfortunately you were to be harmed or killed, there is evidence in writing about the weapons. So that sort of thing is good to do. if you think you're going to leave, contacting legal services as soon as you can and getting an attorney. It's so hard to navigate the legal system on your own, and lots of women do have to do that.
So are there avenues as far as legal services that are actually free for individuals wanting to leave?
There are. The unfortunate thing about legal services, just like any other government-funded entity, is that they get X amount of money every year, and once they run out, they run out. I would really like to see a group of attorneys in our area kind of come together and say, like, hey, I'm going to take five pro bono cases this year. I'm going to take 5. That way I had a place to send people when legal services runs out, but I also understand we have to make a living. So.
Are there some things that the victim might need to put in the back of their mind that sometimes might happen, that they need to be prepared? I know
be prepared to fight like hell. That's what they need to do. Yeah, I mean, things are going to happen. People that you thought were in your corner are not going to be in your corner anymore. Like I said, the church that you've attended all your life, that's what, is going to say you need to fix this. You need to stay with them. You're going to have to prove sometimes that you're a fit parent when you were the one doing most of the child rearing. There's so many things that are going to happen when you leave, and you've got to decide that you're strong enough to face those things.
I know one of the other things I've seen too is that sometimes they have to be prepared that the aggressor might try to press charges or deal with the legal situation against them instead of.
Yes, a lot of times you'll see the abuser file an order of protection against the victim, and you're just kind of like, what's that all about? But they have to present that narrative to the community at large that they are innocent, and I think that's part of it. And
or theft or other things that they'll try to bring up just to bring your enthusiasm down and try to break you down.
They do. The level, did want to make sure I said today that just because you leave doesn't mean the abuse suddenly ends. I still have to co-parent with my abuser, which was super hard, and there's just things that come up you never ever thought about, like when your kid gets married, how am I going to navigate their wedding with this abuser present? So just being sympathetic to the fact that just because someone leaves doesn't mean, hey, it's fixed, and being able to address those needs as they come up.
And how does the state deal with, from your experience, abusers that constantly continue it? With, let's say, if you're out of the situation, all of a sudden they end up marrying someone else, and it goes through the same thing.
I haven't seen the state do a lot. I mean, in my opinion, most abusers are able to kind of slither their way through the court system unless they do something very heinous. I just think a lot of it goes unnoticed.
What are some of the last things that you would like to share or convey to individual victims?
I would just like for anybody listening that thinks they may be in an abusive situation, if you're ready to reach out, reach out. If you're not, I pray that you're ready to reach out one day because you deserve better. If you have any sort of mental health crisis and you need help in a pinch, you can call or text 988, and a trained clinician will respond to you. I said earlier, you can drop by Boot Hill Counseling, see a crisis counselor. We have a crisis line also, 1-800-356-5395. Guess that's about all I have to say. Just take care of yourselves, and when you're ready to leave, somebody will be there for you.
That's great to hear. And I know that a lot of the police officers, you can actually contact the police stations, the sheriff's department, some of the churches, even here with Pastor Bob. You have a lot of resources out there. And even just going to something as simple as your local library to get the information. If you're feeling uncomfortable trying to find that information, just go there every once in a while and get that information and read it, and you still have that there. So
My name is Christy Phelps. You can call me at Boot Hill Counseling Services at 471-0800, and I will do everything I can to help keep you safe until you're ready to leave and walk that path with you.
thank you very much, and we appreciate everything.